Good evening. Welcome to Hashtag Got Money. I am Elizabeth Jackson. So a lot of things have kind of come up as a result of COVID, which we all know about. We're all living it and we're in the middle of it. But I was reading an article the other week and having a conversation with Melanie from Southeast Lawyers, who, we just, she's our people. We were talking about the divorce rate in Australia, and I was looking at some of the media coverage around it, and it's a bit of a pandemic itself. So I've invited Courtney, who is a senior family lawyer from Southeast Lawyers, to join the show. Good evening, Courtney. Welcome to Hashtag Got Money.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So they're saying, and I've got the article, funnily enough, they're calling it the Christmas dynamic, and I guess that alludes to everybody being locked in and not being able to go far, and all the family being together. We're starting to see cracks appear in relationships and long-term relationships. And I just kind of I was speaking to my partner about it the other day. We've got a really good relationship, so we can have conversations called, would you tell me you were going to divorce me, or would you speak to a lawyer first? And we had discussed that in the car, and she said she thinks people should speak to a solicitor first before they let their partner know. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's very common, and it's important that you do that so that you're aware of what your rights are before you then have that conversation with your partner, so that you know where you stand, what the future looks like, and how best to navigate that path. Because for a lot of couples, it's the first time either of them have come into contact with the legal system, a lawyer, and it's good to have that peace of mind, I think, to give yourself a basis of what are you actually looking at, what is separation, how's that going to look for your particular family dynamic, what expectations you should have, and particularly around the care arrangements for children, but also it's financially devastating to separate, and you need to be really clear on what that looks like, what your future is going to look like.
Yeah, there was a post on Facebook the other week, and a child had obviously been a breakdown in the relationship, and the partners were living separately, but one of the children went to visit dad. And as neither partners had stated that they had sole custody of the child, the father decided he would go ahead and take care of that, so the child was not returned to the mother. Mm. There are so many different anomalies in navigating separation that I think there's some viability about getting hold of your solicitor first. Yes. What are people wanting to know from you?
I think for a lot of parents, the first question is, what happens to the kids? What are my rights in terms of care of the kids? And look, there's typically in most relationships a primary carer, the person who, not necessarily primary because they're not working, but primary because they look after all of the external stuff for children that needs to be arranged, schooling, getting them to appointments, booking the appointments that they need for medical things, education-related decisions. There's usually one parent who is primarily responsible for those types of activities relating to the children. So it's important, I think, that people get the understanding from the outset about whether they are the primary carer, and when they are, what choices they have and what control they have over the situation, because a lot of parents typically feel that they don't have control of it, and the reality is quite different. So that's always something that is so worth getting advice about, so that you're clear from the outset and you can move forward on that basis. In that circumstance where there is no orders in place from the court, then essentially either party can attempt to assume that role, but it still would then go back to a court decision if that was necessary to determine who was the primary carer and where the children should live, what's in their children's best interests.
And so talk to me about the time frame of getting that resolved during COVID. If a parent decides that they want sole custody, how are the courts managing that in this environment?
Yep. The courts at the moment have developed what they've essentially labelled a COVID list. So in circumstances where either there are no orders in place and one parent is preventing the other from spending time with children, the parent who's been cut off essentially has the right to go to the court and make an urgent application, and they will be heard very, very promptly. And the same goes for if there are orders in place and one parent has still unilaterally decided that they are not going to make the child available because it's too much of a risk for the children, for themselves, for their extended family. And again, those parties that have been cut off can go straight to the court and make an urgent application because the court's not having it. The family court has been extremely clear about their position on this, which is children need to be spending time with both parents, and that's a priority. And COVID is not an excuse to cut children off from seeing their parents. There's nothing more important than the relationship between children and their parents. So that will be dealt with immediately. So there's a lot of people might feel like they can't do anything about it, but the court is very aware of that issue and very proactive about it.
Yeah, we've seen an escalation too in family violence during COVID, which is really distressing. I'm speaking to Jeanette Marge, who's part of the show, and she said steps who are normally the first contact, and usually during the day when the other spouse is out, they're not getting the same volume of calls. The calls are now just going straight to the police. And she said something really interesting to me the other day when I was speaking to her. She said what we're saying is instead of the mother and child going to shelter, the abuser, and whether that's male or female, I'm disinterested. Violence is violence, is actually being removed from the home and put into temporary accommodation. That feels like a really good response.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I think that the our legal system is very aware of the impact of something like COVID and these rates that will just skyrocket. Because, and even circumstances where you wouldn't necessarily normally have family violence at all, the pressure that COVID has placed on parties financially, socially, on mental health for everybody, you can have a really strong relationship and this pressure is intense and it's unlike anything that most people have of our generation have seen before. And so coping with that's really difficult. So it's certainly a really big risk factor, but I'm hopeful that there are so many fantastic support networks out there that if parties are able to get access to speak to them, that they can do that and will find the right support. The police are very involved in making arrangements to have an abusive person removed from the home. There's also, I think, an increased awareness of what family violence is and that it's not necessarily physical violence. And particularly in this circumstance with the financial pressures, that financial violence is very serious and it's very well hidden in many relationships. You would have no idea that was happening behind closed doors. That and people often think, oh, well, they're not hurting me physically, so I don't really fit that category. So I think there's a general increase in education around that, and bringing that awareness so that people do feel like they can go and access those services.
It feels like a really good service when you're leaving the primary care and the children in the home and you're removing the perpetrator. Do you think that's something that we'll see come out of COVID? Will they continue that as a practice moving forward? Because that feels to me like a better solution.
Yeah, look, it's always ideal. Obviously, keeping kids in a stable and secure environment is a primary concern. Often the case when the victim is leaving the home, it's because of an urgent nature, and they go and then deal with it after the fact. But yes, certainly, if they're in a position whereby the police can remove that person, or by an order of the court remove the offender from the family home, there's so many benefits to that. That of course then has ongoing consequences in terms of who's paying the mortgage. And that's a problem for everybody. It's not just the person with the income necessarily. So there are flow-on issues from that. There's always been a sort of understanding in family law that if you're living in a home and you have the the sole use and privacy of that home, that you need to be paying the mortgage or at least contributing to it. So that then is in contrast with this position where potentially the weaker financial party is staying in the home, but it might allow the offender to continue manipulating by saying, well, I'm not paying the bills, I'm not going to pay any of the utilities, you're on your own. So there's pros and cons, of course.
So there's a financial kind of abuse inside of that too,
Yes,
isn't there? Well, if you want it, you
absolutely.
pay for it. Yeah,
Hmm.
we started the article I read this morning talked about the fact that COVID had created so many financial pressures that people that were planning on separating decided not to separate, but are living
Yes.
cohabitating under the same roof,
Hmm.
which I think is, gosh,
That's really hard.
isn't that hard? That would be really
But
awkward.
look, that's actually very common anyway. That for a lot of parties that separate, perhaps in slightly better circumstances, financially, it's incredibly difficult to run two households, and to do that where one situation is paying a mortgage and one situation might be renting. Um, that's hard, and you might need to access the equity in your home to be able to set up those two new homes. So that means waiting till a house is sold and then getting your division of the funds. So it's extremely common that a lot of people are living under one roof but are separated and essentially sort of living different lives and um, getting on with things. So there's very it's quite common that people come in and say, oh, we've been separated under one roof for a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it might be. And those parties that have been doing it for such a long time typically are more cooperative. um,
When you use
obviously.
the word, it's called cooperative. Yeah,
Cooperative.
it's kind of
Exactly.
it's quite grown up, isn't it? It feels quite,
Very,
um,
very.
let's not have this be about us. Let's support our
Mm,
children through this, and let's
mm,
create a dynamic which is, because really the other side of it too is you're teaching your children how to be respectful in all
mm.
phases of relationship, and that's whether it be a breakdown in relationship.
Yeah.
The financial aspect of dealing with a divorce or a separation, is that something that you manage inside of your practice as well?
Yes, absolutely. And that's where, for a lot of people, the money side of things is extremely important. And why wouldn't it be? Priority is always with the kids. That's always the first discussion that we have, as part of an initial consultation or phone call, is what's happening with the kids. Do you need advice, assistance, guidance with that? And then we move on to the financial side of things, because the financial side of things can be very overwhelming, very stressful, fraught with disagreement, and a long process. And people sort of often aren't prepared for that, that this is not a quick fix. You've separated, you've got a complex financial arrangement between the two of you that needs to be untangled. And the practical aspect of doing that can take time.
So it's not, don't think you can call your lawyer and have it done in 5 minutes, because it's never going to work.
Absolutely not.
But
Absolutely not. And that's a really big misconception about separation, I think.
so call your lawyer first.
Hmm.
Understand that it's going to be a complex event, and that it could
Hmm.
take time. You
Hmm.
deal with the children and the finances. What else crops up as part of that separation?
Child support's something that people need to look into, and that's obviously all done through DHHS. There's a online estimator where people can get really good information, again, before they perhaps leave the family home or finally separate, that they can plug in their financial information, the care arrangements of the kids, the potential care arrangements, I guess, and work out what sort of financial assistance they'll be receiving for the children. So that's a big part of it as well. That and getting around that idea that child support is so that the primary carer can go off and spend all this money on all these wonderful things, when in the reality of our life, child support is woefully below what it actually costs to raise a child. So getting over the hurdle there of that mental view can be tough. So they're the primary things, though, is care arrangements, child support. Um, there's something called spousal maintenance, which is essentially like child support but just between a couple. Um, and I like to call that keeping someone in the lifestyle to which they are accustomed. That you have an obligation to support your partner, your former partner, if you have been doing so, particularly if you've got a primary carer who's not working and then perhaps a high income earner. They have that responsibility to make sure that they are providing support to their spouse. That can be either way of periodic payments like child support, or a lump sum entitlement as part of their property settlement, that here's a chunk. That dismisses our spousal maintenance obligations to each other now. But that's also a big part of a financial settlement.
So, we're the LGBTQIA plus environment. Our acronym gets longer and longer, but anyway, we are. So, are you saying, are you facilitating those types of separations? Because there are, in a lot of our relationships, a primary earner. Sometimes there are both parties that earn very well, but are you negotiating those kinds of separations a lot in this environment?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reality of that situation is, if you're a couple, regardless of the makeup of that couple, you fall under the Family Law Act, and we'll deal with that and help you through that, regardless of the makeup of your relationship.
That's good.
And we're seeing more female income earners. That's becoming more common, obviously, with dads doing the lion's share of the primary care. So that's a very different thing, because we've all got these, preconceived ideas about what a family looks like, and having to re-educate people as we go to make sure that they're aware of, life's changed, and we need to adopt that the view that the court takes, because that's how it's going to end up at the end. If people can't find a resolution themselves, you're going to end up in court, unfortunately.
It's great. I've separated from some partners in the past, and you just kind of take your toothbrush and get the hell out of there. And it's really great that our community has been considered in that regard.
Yes, absolutely. And it was devastating for such a long time that same-sex couples could separate their finances under the Family Law Act but not get married. It just didn't make any sense from a legal perspective. It was baffling that, well, why do you get to fall under the awful part at the end but not the good part at the start, where everything's lovely and happy?
You get to spend all this money on a wonderful wedding. Yeah, I agree.
Exactly. If you get to spend money on the lawyers, you should get to spend money on the wedding, for sure.
Exactly. Champagne, everybody. That's fantastic. Look, talk to me about the cost of a divorce, because it can vary, can't it?
Yes, absolutely. And there's two different things at play there as well. A divorce is literally an application to the court for a divorce. It's, I think, about a $910 application fee. There's a hearing where the court registrar needs to be satisfied that you were married, that you have separated, and that any children of the relationship are cared for appropriately. And then you get a rubber stamp and you're divorced. So that's quite separate to a financial settlement. You can get a divorce once you've been separated for 12 months, regardless of whether you have sorted out your financial position or not. Other parties you might find have actually been separated for years and haven't bothered to actually apply for that piece of paper divorcing them. You can also, people think they need to get a divorce to be able to revert to their maiden name, which is not the case. You can just adopt it back, and you can use your birth certificate or your marriage certificate as evidence of what your name originally was. So that's a divorce, but separation then is quite separate. The divorce side of things is kind of the cheap part. Then the
the divorce is only $1,000.
Exactly. Getting the piece of paper is more expensive than a celebrant to marry you, but still, then the care arrangements and financial separation side of things, that's a little bit of a piece of string type situation. There's obviously the levels of pricing that we look at are things like, can you resolve it by consent at some point? We are able to go back and forth, have some negotiations, hopefully both parties getting legal advice, which always helps, and perhaps engaging a lawyer does actually help with, ensuring that proper advice is given and these are your entitlements, not what you think are your entitlements. And then if you need to go to court, litigation is always very expensive in any scenario. regardless of the jurisdiction that's taking place in. But that certainly is where things get a lot more pricey from our perspective. But look, it's an investment, and that's what people need to bear in mind when they are thinking about how much it's going to cost to have a lawyer involved. Is what does that look like as a percentage of your assets? It's asset protection in a sense. It's making sure you're getting what you are entitled to. And unfortunately, it costs a bit of money to keep your own money, but that's the reality of it, really. So I think that's a hard hurdle for people to come over, but I think that it's very important. And even if it's just getting an initial consultation that might cost, $500, say, give or take, I think that is a very good way to spend your money, to get that advice up front so you know where you stand. And then if you go off to mediation, if you go off and have negotiations by yourself, that's great. But investing that initial consultation money is very, very good use of your funds.
Do you do mediation first and then go, is that a service that you would recommend as part of the stages before you go to litigation?
Absolutely. So the typical course that would happen, I guess, is that I would love to see people doing would be come in to see a lawyer, get your initial advice, know where you stand, what your rights and your entitlements are, where you should be focusing your attentions. If you can, then, and your former spouse is willing, go off to mediation. There's many places that provide free mediation services around Victoria. Engage with those services. You can have a couple of consultations to try and get things resolved. If you get them resolved, great. You go to your lawyer and say, here's the final resolution. Can you document that formally for us? And we can do that by agreement. If they then can't resolve their issues, then they would come back to a lawyer. We would try and negotiate directly with the other party or their lawyer. And then sometimes we engage in mediation roundtable discussions beforehand. It just really, it depends. The terrible legal phrase, it depends on your circumstance. It depends if there's family violence. If there's been family violence, any type of mediation is typically not going to be particularly productive. So it's a sort of case-by-case course of the action that we'll take.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me and for bringing this information to us. It would be a very, very, COVID's been bad enough,
Yeah.
And people are stressed, as soon as we get out of this, I think that we're going to see a lot of relationships repair, which would be really nice. But the other side of it too, I guess the positive side is, if your relationship's not working, get out of it. Do yourself
Absolutely.
favour.
Absolutely.
We're not here long enough on this earth to be bothered with any of that malarkey.
No. I think I like to think about people say, oh, how do you do your job? It must be so, make you feel down all the time. Well, for starters, it makes me go home and try and work on my own marriage. But secondly, I see my job as just part of tidying up the past and allowing people to then move forward with their new life and finding happiness and joy and making sure that they are happy, because once they are, obviously everybody around them, particularly children, will benefit from that. So that's how I view this role. It's, it does have its down moments, but of course, it's just another version of assisting people through a really awful time.
Yeah, it's lovely. And you've got a really nice neutral tonality about you too. I can't imagine that you would either cause either side any upset in your tonality. Everything is about delivery. You've been amazing. Thank you so much. How do our listeners find you?
They can go to our Southeast Lawyers website, which is southeastlawyers.com.au, and I am there. They can contact us through there, or give us a call. And happy to speak to anybody. Obviously, it's definitely a passion, and thank you for those kind words. It's always nice to hear that.
Yeah,
it comes across that way.
Yeah, well, there's no ego. The last thing you need is to be, when you're in something.
No, I don't want to be part of the problem. It's
Yeah,
part of the
exactly right. Exactly
Yep.
right. As As always, I love you guys at Southeast Lawyers. Thank you so much for joining us at Got Money. Take care, everybody. Have a great week. If you've got any questions for any of our guests, please reach out to us through our Facebook page or gmtv.com.au. We are here to help you. And have a wonderful week. We look forward to hanging out with everybody next week. Thank you for that.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely.